On my porch at dawn, my son said, "Don't wave to them." His voice was clipped, quiet, almost embarrassed, as though he thought the neighbors might hear the rustle of my hand moving in the air and mistake it for something shameful. I looked at him, his eyes fixed on the street, his jaw set, and for a brief second I thought he was joking. But his hand reached out, quick and stern, fingers brushing against my wrist, a silent command to lower it. That small touch carried a weight I had never expected to feel from my own child, not correction, not guidance, but dismissal. I raised my hand higher, not out of rebellion but out of something older, deeper, an instinct that told me lowering it would mean lowering myself. The neighbors across the road lifted their own hands in return, smiling in that easy way people do when they catch sight of someone at first light. My son's shoulders stiffened. I felt the air between us chill, though the dawn was soft and warm. I let my hand fall slowly, a deliberate grace in the movement, and I could feel his gaze heavy on me. There was silence after, the kind of silence that makes you wonder if words had ever been worth the trouble. My son pulled at the cuff of his shirt, straightened it, and muttered something I couldn't quite catch, but I knew the tone. It was the same tone he used when speaking to his colleagues on the phone, clipped, impatient, as though everything in the world demanded urgency but me. And yet there we were, standing on the same porch, the same worn boards that had felt the shuffle of his toddler steps, the pounding of his teenage frustrations, and now the sharp heel of his adulthood pressing against the grain. I leaned against the wooden rail and looked at the street as if the answer might lie somewhere between the swaying branches and the cracked pavement. Waving had never been an act of rebellion for me. It was habit, ritual, a way of reminding myself that even as the years peeled away at my edges, I still belonged to the fabric of this place. To deny that wave felt like tearing a stitch from the quilt of my life. I turned my head slowly toward him, hoping to find some softness in his expression, some flicker of regret. There was none. He was already scrolling his phone, the blue light reflected in his eyes like a barrier I could not cross. "You don't have to do that," he said again, this time without looking at me, as though the matter were so obvious it didn't deserve the courtesy of his full attention. "It's unnecessary." He said the word like it was dust he was brushing off his coat, as though the small gesture of greeting the people we'd lived beside for decades was an inconvenience to him, an embarrassment even. Unnecessary. The word stuck to my ribs like something swallowed wrong. I wanted to tell him that when his father was alive, waving at dawn was the first thing we did. That it wasn't about the neighbors so much as it was about acknowledgement, of being, of existing side by side, of saying, "I see you, and I hope this day is kind to you." I wanted to tell him that when he was a child, he used to wave with such enthusiasm that his little arm would flap wildly, and I had to hold his elbow so he wouldn't tip forward off the porch. I wanted to tell him that this porch had seen decades of waves, and each one carried a small seed of continuity, a promise that even as the world shifted, some things remained. But I said nothing. My throat was thick with words that had nowhere to land. The sky was bleeding into pale gold, and the birds were busy stitching the air with song. I thought of how many dawns I had stood there, wrapped in sweaters, holding mugs, waiting for the day to unfold. I thought of the mornings when this porch was filled with laughter, when the smell of pancakes drifted from the kitchen, when his little shoes were scattered like fallen leaves near the door. And now here he was, a man in his own right, taller than me, sharper than me, standing beside me and telling me that something as small as a wave was too much. I felt the ache of distance, not the kind measured in miles but the kind that unravels quietly between two people who once shared everything. He moved back inside after a while, the screen door clicking shut with the same sound it always had, but somehow harsher. I stayed there, hands resting on the rail, eyes following the slow rhythm of the street. The neighbors had gone inside, the world had shifted a little more toward day, and I was left with the echo of his words. Don't wave to them. It wasn't about waving. It never was. It was about the narrowing of space, the shrinking of what I was allowed to do, the quiet insistence that I take up less room in his life, in his world. I didn't cry, not then. The tears didn't come in sharp bursts the way they had when his father passed, or when I sold the old car, or when I packed away the crib he once slept in. This was different. This was a slow heaviness settling in my chest, like a stone dropped into a pond and sinking without ripples. I went back inside eventually, into the dim light of the kitchen where the kettle still held the last of its steam. I poured myself a cup of tea, though the taste felt flat against my tongue, and sat at the table staring at the thin cracks that spidered across its surface. Every mark on that table had a memory, a story. The burn from when I left a hot pan too long. The scratch from his school project. The faint ring from his father's coffee mug. And yet, in that moment, the table seemed only to hold silence. The day moved forward, as days insist on doing, carrying me with it whether I wanted or not. He left for work with a quick goodbye that didn't touch the air between us. The house fell quiet in his absence, the kind of quiet that is too aware of itself. I walked from room to room, each step stirring up fragments of a life that felt both mine and no longer mine. His jacket hung on the back of a chair, his shoes by the door, his presence in every corner, and yet his absence was louder. I found myself returning to the porch, drawn to it like a moth to the one flame still left burning. The street was empty then, no neighbors to wave at, no one to witness me standing there alone. I raised my hand anyway, a small, stubborn gesture into the empty air. My hand felt heavy, my wrist trembling slightly, but I held it there, as though I were waving to time itself, to the years that had passed, to the woman I had been and perhaps still was. It's strange, how something so small can open up a cavern inside you. One moment, one sentence, and suddenly you find yourself questioning the shape of your own existence. I thought of how often I had silenced myself over the years, biting back words for the sake of peace, tucking away dreams for the sake of family, folding myself smaller so others could move freely. And now my own son was telling me not to wave, as though even the smallest gesture of self still needed pruning. I wondered then if I had done him a disservice, raising him in a house where I taught him to speak his mind, to stand tall, to claim his space, while I quietly gave away mine piece by piece. Perhaps he thought this was normal, that I was meant to shrink while he grew. Perhaps I had shown him that without ever meaning to. I sat with those thoughts for hours, letting them twist and turn inside me. The house grew brighter with the noon sun, but I felt none of its warmth. I kept hearing his voice in my head, the sharpness of it, the certainty. And beneath it, my own silence, the silence that had become too familiar. I wondered how many more silences I had left in me, how many more times I would swallow the hurt and call it love, how many more mornings I would stand on that porch and lower my hand because it was easier than lifting it higher. By late afternoon, I decided I couldn't let it rest. Not because of the neighbors, not because of the wave, but because of what it meant. I needed to remember who I was, not just to myself but to him. I set the kettle on again, though I didn't drink the tea. I sat at the table, waiting for the sound of his footsteps returning home. The minutes stretched thin, the air thick with what I would say, though the words were still forming, fragile as glass. And when at last the door opened, when his keys clinked against the bowl on the counter and his shoes scuffed against the mat, I looked at him with all the years of motherhood, of sacrifice, of love, and of silence resting in my eyes. When he came back that evening, I watched him move around the kitchen with the ease of someone who no longer noticed me. He loosened his tie, ran a hand over his hair, checked his phone again. It was as though he had carried the weight of the day on his shoulders and decided I was not strong enough to share it. I wanted to speak then, to tell him what his words that morning had done, but the timing felt brittle. He asked what was for dinner, and I told him, though the words left my lips like stones instead of comfort. We ate in silence, the clinking of forks against plates the only conversation we shared. I studied his face while he ate, the slope of his nose, the shape of his mouth, all features I had memorized from the moment of his birth, now hardened with the angles of adulthood. There was a wall between us, invisible yet undeniable, and for the first time in years I wondered if I had built it myself, brick, by always choosing quiet over confrontation. After he went upstairs, I sat at the table long after my plate was empty. I thought about my life, about the way I had become almost invisible even within the walls I once ruled with care. I thought of mornings when my husband and I had laughed over burnt toast, evenings when the whole family gathered in this very kitchen, filling it with noise and warmth. Now, silence pressed against me from all sides, and even my own son seemed to prefer it that way. I wanted to believe it was stress, that he didn't mean the words, that he carried the weight of the world and sometimes forgot how heavy it felt on others. But something inside me knew better. His words were not a slip, they were a mirror, reflecting how little space I was allowed to take up in his world. The next morning, I rose early again, habit pulling me toward the porch before the sun fully cleared the horizon. The air was crisp, scented faintly with damp earth and the sweetness of blooming flowers. I stood there, alone this time, and when the neighbors stepped out, I lifted my hand. It felt almost ceremonial, almost rebellious, to wave into the open morning without his eyes judging me. They waved back warmly, their faces bright in the early light, and I felt a strange sting behind my eyes. It wasn't the wave itself that moved me, but the reminder that acknowledgement, however small, still tethered me to the world. I was not invisible, not yet. I went back inside with a lighter step, though the weight of yesterday still clung faintly to my chest. I began to notice how many small silences I had accepted over the years. How many times I had swallowed back words in order to keep the peace, how many times I had convinced myself that my feelings were less urgent than others. The realization crept in slowly, like water seeping through cracks. I remembered when he was a teenager, slamming doors and muttering under his breath, and I had told myself it was just a phase, that it would pass. I remembered how, after his father's death, I made myself smaller so he would not drown in grief, telling myself that my own mourning could wait. Somewhere along the way, waiting had become a habit. Now here I was, decades into the habit, realizing it had cost me pieces of myself I could never retrieve. That afternoon, while he was at work, I dug through an old box in the attic. Inside were photographs, letters, and trinkets from a life that once felt fuller. I held a picture of myself from years ago, hair dark and thick, eyes sharp with ambition, a smile that seemed to promise the world. I barely recognized that woman. I traced the edges of the photo with my thumb, remembering how alive she had felt, how unafraid. I wondered what she would think of me now, standing in the dim attic light, clutching a photo like a lifeline. Perhaps she would be disappointed. Perhaps she would be patient. I set the photo aside and found an old scarf, deep blue with tiny embroidered flowers. I had loved that scarf once, but I hadn't worn it in years. I draped it around my shoulders and stared into the small mirror propped against the wall. The woman looking back at me seemed different, softened but not gone. I left the scarf on, a quiet reminder that I still existed, even if the world had forgotten. When my son returned home that evening, he barely noticed the scarf. He said little as usual, his attention divided between his phone and the television. I wanted him to look at me, really look, but I did not ask for it. Instead, I sat beside him for a while, watching the screen though I couldn't follow the story. My mind was elsewhere, wandering down paths of memory and possibility. Later, when he went to bed, I stayed up. I poured myself a glass of wine, something I rarely did, and sat at the table with the scarf still around my shoulders. I felt a strange sense of defiance in that moment, though no one was there to witness it. It was not about being seen by him. It was about being seen by myself. The days slipped by, each one pulling the thread of that morning on the porch a little tighter. I waved each dawn, sometimes to the neighbors, sometimes to no one at all. I began walking to the market on my own, choosing the ripest fruit, speaking with vendors, letting my voice fill the air even in small ways. I bought a new notebook and started writing again, not for anyone else, just for myself. Thoughts, reflections, memories spilled onto the page. It was strange at first, like learning to use muscles I hadn't exercised in years. But with each word, I felt the faint pulse of something returning, something I thought I had lost for good. Yet the silence between us remained. My son spoke to me when necessary, polite but distant, as though I were a tenant in his home rather than his mother. Sometimes I wondered if he noticed the change in me, the subtle shifts, the way I carried myself with a little more steadiness. If he did, he said nothing. And I, still cautious, let the silence stretch rather than force words into it. But inside, I was beginning to feel a current, slow but steady, pulling me towards something I could not yet name. One evening, while we sat at the table, I finally let a piece of it slip through. He was telling me about work, rattling off numbers and deadlines, his voice detached. When he paused, I looked at him and said, "Do you remember when you were little, how you used to wave at everyone who passed by? You'd wave until your arm got tired, and sometimes you'd even shout just to make sure they saw you." He looked up, puzzled, and frowned slightly, as though he couldn't imagine himself that way. You loved being seen, I added softly. You loved connecting, even in small ways. He shifted uncomfortably, muttered something about how things were different then, and went back to his meal. But I saw it, a flicker, brief but real, in his eyes. A memory stirring, perhaps, or the faint discomfort of truth. That night, I lay awake in bed, the words replaying in my mind. I wondered if I had done the right thing, if it was better to leave the silence unbroken. But no, I knew I had to start somewhere, even if it was small. Change does not roar in all at once, it whispers first, testing the air. And I was ready, at last, to listen. The morning came quietly, as it always does, but inside me something was stirring that would not be hushed. I had grown used to my small rituals, the wave at dawn, the scarf draped across my shoulders, the steady rhythm of writing in my notebook, and they had become a kind of armor, delicate but real. When I stepped onto the porch that day, the air smelled of damp grass, the kind that clings to your shoes when you walk across the lawn too early. The neighbors were out, carrying bags to their car, and I lifted my hand in greeting. My son appeared behind me just then, his voice carrying the same edge as before. I told you not to do that, he said, his words cutting through the morning light like a blade. This time, I did not lower my hand. I let it linger in the air until the neighbors noticed and waved back, their smiles broad and genuine. Only then did I lower it, deliberately, slowly, as though placing something precious back into its box. I turned to him, meeting his eyes. Why does it bother you? I asked, my voice calm, steady. He looked at me with disbelief, as though he had not expected me to question him. It just does, he said, already turning away, brushing past me into the house. But I had seen the flicker in his eyes, not anger this time, but discomfort, like a boy caught in a lie he couldn't explain. I carried that moment with me the entire day. His discomfort was telling, though he did not realize it. For years I had mistaken silence for peace, compliance for love, but now I was learning to see the difference. His need to quiet me was not about the wave, it was about control, about shaping the world to his comfort even if it meant shrinking me to fit. And I, who had raised him with every ounce of patience and sacrifice I could summon, had allowed it without question. Until now. That afternoon I went into town. I hadn't done that alone in years, not because I couldn't, but because somewhere along the line I had stopped. The streets were familiar, yet they felt new, alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. I walked past the bakery, inhaling the sweet scent of warm bread, past the bookstore with its faded awning, past the park where children still shrieked with the kind of joy that pierces the air. I bought myself a pastry, something I never would have indulged in before, and ate it slowly on a bench in the sun. Each bite tasted like reclamation, like proof that small pleasures still belonged to me. I thought of my husband then, how he had always encouraged me to take up space, to laugh loudly, to wave without hesitation. He had never once told me to quiet myself for the sake of appearances. If he were alive, I wondered, would our son still have grown into this man who flinched at small gestures? Or had I, in my grief, folded myself so small that my son had learned to expect nothing else from me? The thought hurt, but it also sharpened something inside me. I could not go back and undo the past, but I could refuse to repeat it. That evening, when I returned home, my son asked where I had been. His tone was casual, but I caught the faint edge of surprise in his voice. Out, I said simply, hanging my bag on the hook by the door. He raised an eyebrow. Out where? He pressed. I smiled faintly, not unkindly. Just out. For myself. He blinked, and for a moment his mouth opened as though he wanted to argue, but no words came. He nodded instead, though the crease between his brows deepened. I walked past him into the kitchen, the scarf still around my shoulders, and poured myself a glass of water as though I had done nothing extraordinary. But inside, I felt the quiet pulse of victory. In the days that followed, I began to notice how often he tried to shape me into silence without even realizing it. A frown when I laughed too loudly at a television show. A sigh when I spoke to the cashier at the store with more friendliness than he deemed necessary. A subtle shake of the head when I lingered too long in the garden, chatting with a neighbor over the fence. Little gestures, little signals, designed to keep me small. And for so long, I had obliged. But now, each time, I resisted, gently, almost imperceptibly, but firmly. A louder laugh, a longer chat, a hand lifted higher in greeting. Each act was a thread, weaving me back into myself. One night, as I sat writing in my notebook, he came into the room and watched me for a moment. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice cautious, as though he had stumbled onto something unfamiliar. "Writing," I said. "About what?" he asked again. I looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "About my life." He shifted on his feet, clearly unsettled. "Why?" The question hung in the air, absurd in its simplicity. I smiled faintly. "Because it's mine." He didn't reply. He left the room quietly, and I returned to my writing, the pen moving more easily than before. It struck me then how much he had grown used to my silence, how foreign it must have felt to him to see me filling space with words, with presence. But that was not my burden to carry. For years I had allowed his comfort to dictate my shape. Now I was learning to live for mine. One Sunday, we were invited to a small gathering at a neighbor's house. I had not attended one in years, always sending him in my place while I stayed behind to tidy the house, to cook, to be useful in the ways no one ever truly noticed. This time, I decided to go. I dressed carefully, choosing a blouse I hadn't worn in years, and the same blue scarf that had become my quiet banner of selfhood. When I stepped into the living room, he looked at me with surprise. "You're coming?" he asked. "Of course," I said, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. At the gathering, I spoke with neighbors, laughed at their stories, shared my own. I felt the rhythm of conversation return to me, rusty at first but soon natural, like a song I had once known by heart. My son hovered nearby, his eyes flicking to me often, uncertain. But I did not let his gaze shrink me. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to simply exist in company, to be seen, to be heard. When we returned home, the silence between us was thicker than usual. He sat on the couch, scrolling his phone, while I tidied the kitchen. "Finally," he said, "you didn't have to do all that tonight." His tone was careful, but the meaning clear. I turned to him, drying my hands on a towel, and said softly, "I know. But I wanted to." He looked at me for a long moment, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words, then said nothing. The silence that followed was different this time, not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of realization, of something shifting beyond his control. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I thought of how far I had come in such a short time. From the porch at dawn to the neighbor's living room, from silence to laughter, from shrinking to standing. It was not a transformation anyone else would notice at first glance, but inside me it was seismic. I was learning, slowly, to reclaim myself. And though I did not yet know where it would lead, I knew this: I would never lower my hand again. Not for him, not for anyone. The turning point came not with shouting, not with slammed doors, but with a simple moment at the dinner table. He had made a comment about my day, something small, something dismissive. "You've been busy waving and chatting again, I suppose," he said with a crooked smile that wasn't really a smile at all. There was no malice in his tone, but there was condescension, the kind that lands heavier than cruelty because it hides behind lightness. I set down my fork and looked at him steadily. "Yes," I said. "I have. And I enjoyed it." The words were simple, but they landed between us like stones dropped into a still pond, rippling outward. He blinked at me, caught off guard, and for the first time in a long while, he had no immediate reply. The silence stretched until it grew uncomfortable. He cleared his throat, shifted in his chair, and said, It makes people talk. You don't have to put yourself out there like that." His eyes avoided mine, fixed instead on his plate, as though he knew even as he said it that the words were weak. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice soft but firm. "Let them talk, if they want. I've lived long enough to know it doesn't matter. He finally looked at me, and there was something in his gaze, frustration, confusion, maybe even fear. I held his eyes until he looked away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional creak of the house settling into its bones. His words echoed in my mind, but more than that, the realization that my growing independence was unsettling him. I wondered if he even knew why it bothered him so much. Perhaps it wasn't the neighbors, or the waves, or the conversations. Perhaps it was the shift in balance, the slow unraveling of the quiet, compliant mother he had grown accustomed to. And perhaps, in some small way, he feared losing me, though he didn't know how to name that fear except through control. In the morning, I rose early again. The porch was cool beneath my feet, the air crisp and still. When the neighbors stepped out, I waved, high and proud. My hand trembled slightly, but I held it steady until they waved back. For a moment, I felt the strength of it, the defiance, the belonging. My son came out just then, his expression already shadowed. "Why do you keep doing this?" he asked, exasperation edging his voice. I turned to him, my hands still raised. "Because I can," I said. The words surprised even me, but once they were spoken, I felt a weight lift. He stared at me, jaw tight, and then stormed back inside without another word. I sat on the porch long after he left, sipping my tea, watching the day bloom around me. The tension in the house was growing heavier, each interaction tinged with unspoken conflict. Yet I felt lighter, freer, as though each act of resistance loosened a knot that had been tied too tightly for too long. Still, there was pain in it. Each time I saw the distance in his eyes, I felt the sharp ache of loss, as though every wave carried me a little further from him even as it brought me closer to myself. That week, I found myself reflecting more on my role as a mother. Had I given him too much? Had I taught him that my sacrifices were simply the natural order of things, invisible and expected? I remembered the years after his father's death, how I had poured myself into making life stable for him, how I had hidden my grief so he wouldn't drown in it. I had thought I was being strong, but perhaps he had only learned that my feelings were secondary, expendable. The thought cut deep, but it also clarified something. I could not go back and change the lessons he had absorbed. But I could change what he saw from me now. So I began to carve out more space. I joined a small group at the library that met once a week to discuss books. The first time I told him, he looked at me with disbelief. "Why?" he asked. "Because I want to," I replied simply. He didn't argue, but the crease between his brows told me everything. I went anyway, and when I sat in that circle of women, discussing words and characters and lives beyond our own, I felt the ground beneath me steady in a way it hadn't in years. I laughed that night, a laugh unburdened, not measured by anyone's comfort but my own. When I came home, he was sitting on the couch, the television glowing in the dark. He looked up at me as I walked in, his face unreadable. "How is it?" he asked after a long pause. "Good," I said, setting my bag down. It was good. I didn't elaborate, didn't explain myself, and the simplicity of that answer felt like another victory. But victories, I learned, come with consequences. The more I reached for myself, the more unsettled he became. One evening, after I returned from the market, he confronted me. "You've changed," he said bluntly, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. "You're different." I looked at him, my grocery bag still in my hands, and said, "I'm becoming myself again." He shook his head, frustrated. "It's just strange. You're not acting like you used to." I set the bags down, my hands trembling slightly. "Maybe that's the point," I said softly. "Maybe I shouldn't have been acting like that for so long." His face hardened, and for a moment I thought he might shout. But instead, he turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. I stood in the kitchen, my heart pounding, my breath uneven. The confrontation had left me shaken, but beneath the tremor of fear was a steady current of resolve. For so long, I had silenced myself for his sake. Now, at last, I was learning to speak, and I would not unlearn it. That night, I wrote for hours in my notebook, pouring out every thought, every memory, every ache. I wrote about the porch, about the wave, about the years of silence and the small acts of defiance. I wrote until my hand ached, until the words blurred on the page. And when I finally set down my pen, I felt a strange peace. The story was still unfinished, but for the first time, I felt like I was writing it on my own terms. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning. I was on the porch again, my scarf looped around my shoulders, tea warm in my hands. The neighbors were out watering their flowers, and as always, I lifted my hand. My son stepped outside just as I did it, and his voice snapped through the stillness. "Enough, Mom. I told you not to do that." His tone was sharper this time, laced with something harsher than embarrassment, something closer to anger. The neighbors glanced over, their smiles faltering, and I felt the heat rise to my cheeks. But I didn't lower my hand. I kept it raised until they waved back, then brought it down slowly, deliberately. He turned to me, his face taut with frustration. "Why do you keep defying me?" The word cut me open. Defying. As though I were a child breaking rules, not a woman reclaiming her own breath. I looked at him, really looked, and for the first time I spoke without hesitation. "Because I am not yours to control." The silence after those words was thick, almost suffocating. His eyes widened, his mouth opened as if to reply, but nothing came. He turned sharply and went back inside, the screen door slamming behind him. I stayed there, trembling, my hands still tingling from the wave. Inside, the air was charged. I could feel it pressing against me as I entered the kitchen. He was pacing, his hands running through his hair. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice low but shaking. "Why now? After all these years, why suddenly, this?" He gestured vaguely at me, at the scarf, at the way I stood taller, straighter. I set my cup down carefully on the table, the porcelain clinking against the wood. "Because I have spent years disappearing," I said softly. "And I won't disappear anymore." His face twisted, pain flickering through his eyes. "I'm just trying to protect you," he said. "People talk. They notice. They judge." His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time I saw something beneath the anger, fear. He wasn't just angry. He was afraid. Afraid of what others thought, yes, but also of change, of losing the version of me he had always known. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Protect me from what? From being seen? From being alive? My voice rose then, not in anger but in sorrow, decades of swallowed words rising all at once. "I raised you to stand tall, to speak your mind, to claim your place in this world. And I taught myself to be small so you could be big. But I can't do it anymore. I won't." He looked at me as though seeing me for the first time. His eyes were wet, though he blinked quickly, trying to hide it. "You don't understand," he whispered. "Dad's gone. It's just us. People look at you and I don't want them to think you're fragile. Or strange. Or," he trailed off, unable to finish. I stepped closer, placing my hand gently on his arm. "You think my wave makes me fragile? That talking to neighbors makes me weak? No. What makes me fragile is silence. What makes me weak is pretending I don't exist. And I won't teach you that lesson anymore." His shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I stood there, watching him, my heart heavy with love and sorrow all at once. He was still my son, the boy I had carried and soothed, the boy who once waved so hard at strangers that his little arm ached. But he was also this man, struggling with fear he could not name, trying to protect me in ways that suffocated rather than sheltered. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes red. "I just don't want to lose you," he said quietly. The words pierced me. You're not losing me, I said, kneeling beside him so our eyes met. You're finding me. Maybe for the first time. He shook his head, confused, torn. It feels like you're slipping away. I touched his cheek, my thumb brushing the faint stubble there. No. I've been slipping away for years. But now, I'm holding on. The day passed in uneasy quiet after that. He avoided me, retreating into his room, while I stayed downstairs, writing in my notebook. My hand moved furiously across the page, capturing every word, every feeling. I wrote about the confrontation, about his fear, about my sorrow and my resolve. And as I wrote, I realized something: this was not just about him. It was about me, about all the years I had silenced myself for the sake of peace, for the sake of love. It was about reclaiming the parts of me that had been buried under motherhood, under grief, under expectation. That evening, when he came down for dinner, the air was still thick with unspoken tension. But I set the table as I always did, placed the food between us, and sat down. We ate quietly at first, but then I said, "Do you remember the summer we painted the porch?" He looked up, startled. "You were 10. You insisted on painting your half by yourself, and you dripped paint everywhere." Your father and I laughed until our sides hurt. His expression softened, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I remember," he said quietly. The paint never came off the railing. We sat in that memory for a moment, the heaviness between us easing slightly. It was then I realized that the bridge between us wasn't gone, it was strained, cracked, but not gone. And perhaps, if I held my ground without anger, if I continued to wave, to write, to laugh, he might learn that my independence was not his loss but his inheritance. Later that night, as I stood on the porch once more, I lifted my hand into the empty air. The street was quiet, no neighbors in sight, but I waved anyway. My son watched me from the doorway, his expression unreadable. He didn't stop me this time. He didn't join me either. But he watched, and that was enough. The days after that Sunday passed differently. Something had shifted between us, not smoothed out entirely, but altered. He spoke less about my habits, less about what I should or shouldn't do. Instead, he watched. Sometimes from the doorway, sometimes from the kitchen table as I scribbled in my notebook, sometimes from across the street when I lingered too long in conversation with the neighbors. His silence was no longer the silence of dismissal, it was the silence of someone learning, hesitating at the edge of understanding. I, too, had changed. I no longer waved timidly, no longer worried about whether my small gestures embarrassed him. I waved because it tethered me to the life still blooming around me. I laughed when something struck me funny, even if his eyes flicked up in surprise. I walked to the market, to the library, to the park, sometimes alone, sometimes with company. With each step, I felt myself settling back into the world. One evening, I came home from the library group and found him sitting on the porch. The same porch where it had all begun, the same wooden boards that had held decades of our lives. He wasn't on his phone, wasn't distracted. He was just sitting, his elbows on his knees, staring at the quiet street. I stopped, uncertain, and he turned to me. His face was softer than I'd seen it in years. "I remember Dad used to wave too," he said quietly. The words caught me off guard. He rarely mentioned his father, rarely opened that door. He didn't care who was watching. He just waved. I sat beside him, the boards creaking under our combined weight. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I said, "Maybe that's where you learned it. Before you forgot." He gave a small, almost sheepish smile. "Maybe." The sky above us deepened into dusk, the air cooling with the scent of cut grass. When a car passed, I lifted my hand automatically. To my surprise, he lifted his too. A small, hesitant wave, but a wave nonetheless. My throat tightened, and I looked away, not wanting him to see the tears in my eyes. We didn't speak much that night, but something had been mended, however fragile. He still didn't fully understand, perhaps never would, but he was trying. And in that trying, I felt a kind of peace. I know now that my life is not meant to be folded into silence. I am not meant to shrink for the comfort of others, not even for my son. Love is not silence. Love is standing whole before one another, even when it unsettles, even when it hurts. The next morning, I stood on the porch again, tea in my hand, scarf around my shoulders. The dawn was pale and beautiful, the air still, the world waiting to be acknowledged. The neighbors stepped out, and I raised my hand high. From behind me, I heard the door open, the faint sound of footsteps. My son stood there, watching. For a moment, I thought he might stop me. But instead, he stood quietly, his hands at his sides. He didn't wave this time. But he didn't look away either. And that was enough. As the neighbors waved back, I felt the steadiness of the porch beneath my feet, the softness of the scarf against my neck, the warmth of the cup in my hand. Small things, yes, but each one proof that I was still here, still whole, still mine. Sometimes love is letting go of who we once were to make space for who we must become. Sometimes it is standing tall even when the world, even when your own blood, asks you to be small. And sometimes it is as simple as raising your hand into the morning air, knowing that even if no one waves back, you have chosen not to disappear. That is what I learned on my porch at dawn. That is what I will carry with me for however many mornings I have left.